Is there a way for me to move this out of the way?
I feel like there should be. For that, I think if you click there, that'll mostly go away. I think there's a way to hide. Oh, there we go.
Cool.
Tuck that right there.
Anyway, thank you for coming to our seminar today. Dr. Auriel Fournier is our guest. Dr. McPherson invited her to come here. I don't know if you want to mention anything, but they are talking about doing some collaborations. She's worked with students in the past and finished a couple students, so we're hoping to keep that connection going with the Illinois Natural History Survey. Dr. Fournier is the director of Forbes Biological Station, so that's really cool. The neat thing I found out, and I just remembered when I looked at the CV again, is that she's an alumni from University of Arkansas, and me and Sue are both alumni from University of Arkansas also. She actually got her Ph.D. in 2017 from the biological sciences, and I guess worked with Arkansas Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Service. Before that, though, in 2011, she was at the Michigan Technology University and had a wildlife ecology and management degree from there. Then she did a postdoc at Mississippi State University from 2017 to 2019. And as I mentioned before, she's the director of Forbes Biological Station and started in June 2019. And it's incredible to have you so close to us and have collaborators and things like that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I haven't even said anything yet. All right. Well, I really appreciate you all being here today. It's exciting to be here at Western and get to share with you all a little bit of what we've been up to at Forbes over the past couple of years. How to make the slide go forward.
Arrow key.
There we go. All right. So I want to start by thanking a lot of people. I'm going to talk about kind of a wide variety of projects today, and it's not just me that is doing them. I have an awesome team of staff at Forbes Biological Station, including 2 Western graduates, Theron Bradshaw and Andy Gilbert, who I get to work with on a day-to-day basis. And I also work with some really amazing graduate students as well, as along with a lot of collaborators with many of our state and federal partners. And I am the director at Forbes, and I'm not going to talk about the field station history a whole lot today, but I thought I would briefly share just a little bit about what we do. We're the oldest inland field station in North America. We're celebrating our 130th anniversary next year. We're really excited about that. Stephen Forbes started doing science there along the Illinois River in 1894, and a lot of that work was focused on the Illinois River and its associated floodplains, and we kind of continue that legacy today, doing a lot of work focused on wetlands, especially floodplain wetlands. The thing that we're most known for is the aerial waterfowl survey. We're in our 75th year of flying a plane along the Illinois and Mississippi rivers and counting ducks, and that's what Josh does most weeks out of the year. He was up in the airplane yesterday. We also do a lot of work at the Emequon Preserve, which is a nature conservancy property about an hour east of here. And that's a big part of Andy's job, is documenting the restoration of that site from the soybean field that it was in the year 2000 to this beautiful emergent wetland that it is today. And we're currently doing a large project with the Illinois DNR. This is Theron in a tree. This is Theron not in a tree. Looking at hunting disturbance. So we're putting out automated recording units and trying to understand how hunting pressure, especially through just the sounds of gunshots, is pushing birds around the landscape. And so we do a lot of work that is very driven by the agency, and we're really proud of that work. And kind of broadly speaking, our work is trying to inform wetland management here in Illinois and across the country. Hopefully I don't have to argue with the folks in this room too much about the importance of wetlands, but I do think that it's good to take a step back and realize that in our not too distant past, we thought about wetlands in a really different way. So if you can read up at the top here, it says wetlands in need of drainage. So this is in 1919. By this point, we'd already removed a lot of our wetlands in Illinois. By 1919, we'd already done a pretty good job of draining them. But we still had this mindset that these places were not a desirable part of our landscape. We saw them as, places that were full of disease. I mean, they certainly produce a lot of organisms that can pass diseases on to us as humans. We didn't see it as a desirable place, and we also knew that the soil underneath them was really rich for agriculture. And so we wanted to drain them and start planting it into corn and soybeans, and we've done a pretty good job of that. But it does mean that the wetlands that we have now are even more important. And a lot of times that importance can put a lot of strain on those wetlands. So we're asking the wetlands that remain today, which here in Illinois, we've lost over 90% of our wetlands. We're asking the wetlands that remain to be wildlife habitat for a wide variety of organisms. My talk today is going to focus on birds, but that's certainly not the only kind of critter that uses our wetlands. We're also helping them to be an important part of water quality, to protect us from storms and from flooding. And they're also a really important area for recreation, for kayaking and for fishing, for duck hunting. Over $140 million annually is spent by duck hunters in Illinois alone. And so when we think about wetlands within this state, they're incredibly important. I also do work in the Gulf of Mexico, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And there, when we think about coastal wetlands, we're also thinking about, reduction in storm surge from hurricanes, which has a monetary value attached to it, but also has the literal value of human lives that are saved from having these wetlands in coastal systems. So the way that we think about wetlands has changed a lot, but we're asking our wetlands to wear a lot of hats. We're asking them to do a lot of things at the same time, which is incredibly challenging, especially when you think about how to manage a wetland for that. So if we just think about birds, we're asking a wetland to be good breeding habitat. We're asking it to be good habitat in the fall for all these birds that spent the summer up in Canada and are coming down south. We're asking them to be good wintering habitat. And that's just for the birds. When we start to bring in amphibians, fish, invertebrates, a whole other suite of organisms, when we start thinking about flood control and everything else, we're asking a lot of a type of habitat that we've so greatly reduced on the landscape. And that can make things really challenging. And it can lead our natural resource managers at our agencies to really have to look at strong trade-offs. So if we think about wetlands in terms of water level management, which if we're thinking about non-wooded wetlands, that's often one of our main management tools is water level management. The way that we manage wetlands right now looks a lot like this. So we're sitting here in October. The ducks are coming. For those of you who are not tuned into duck season opens in this part of the state very soon. People are very excited. And so this blue distribution here is the water. We are bringing the water onto these wetlands to provide habitat for all of these birds that have primarily spent their summer further north from us, hatching out lots of cute little baby birds, and now they're coming south. And we are timing our management to provide this recreation opportunity for them, okay? And we hold that water sometimes through the winter to provide good wintering habitat for those species, especially for mallards, which are increasingly spending the winter here in Illinois. And then as the ducks move out, we bring the water levels down in these systems. And there's a good reason that we do that. So the emergent wetlands that we have here in Illinois evolutionarily didn't have lots of standing water in them throughout the entire year. These floodplain wetlands went through annual wet and dry cycles because of the flood regimes of the river. And the rivers around here would have typically flooded in the spring and then dried out a little bit in the summer. And this can be a really important time of year for the germination of a lot of the annual plants that all of these fall migrating birds are really interested in, all right? So a lot of our wetland management is timed around ducks because ducks are what people shoot and what they're really excited about. When we start to think about all these other organisms that are coming in, things get more complicated. So my PhD work was focused on this bird, which is the sora. Also a wetland dependent bird, uses the same wetlands that wood ducks and mallards are using, but is using them slightly earlier in the season and thus is encountering a largely dry landscape. And dry wetlands don't provide the same food resources that wet wetlands do. And so if we just look at a singular time of year, we can already see potential areas for there to be these conflicts, and it can get a lot more complicated from there on out. We have several species of wetland bird here in Illinois that are state listed as either threatened or endangered, including species like least bittern, common gallinule. They are nesting in these wetlands in the summer, and they would prefer that those wetlands have water in them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here, but in a moment here. But then we start to see these cross-seasonal needs for trade-off. And then we also have spring migration, which is still a big unknown for a lot of our non-waterfowl species. All of that is also in the backdrop of the fact that in Illinois, we have dramatically changed our landscape. I started my job in June of 2019. This is looking out the window of Forbes Biological Station. This is supposed to be a creek, and this is supposed to be a 20-foot tall levee. The Illinois River was at like the 4th highest flood that it's ever been at. And these floods are coming at the wrong time of year more and more. So if we look at this hydrograph from the late 1800s, we see we largely had spring and summer floods. Now we're seeing floods all different times of the year. So even if you're a wetland manager and you have a really good idea of the kind of habitat you want to produce for a given bird, it can be really difficult because the river may change your whole plan. So things have gotten complicated. But let's take a little bit of a walk through the annual cycle and talk a little bit more about some of these trade-offs. So we already talked a little bit about the trade-offs between when we look at rails versus waterfowl. That was a lot of what my graduate work focused on. And in that case, we were actually able to find kind of a happy medium, an instance where we could flood some of our wetlands earlier to provide habitat for these marsh birds, and we didn't see a negative impact on the waterfowl. So a win-win. This is what we like to find. We don't find it very often, but when we find it, we're very excited. It's also a time of year where we need to spend a little bit more time kind of questioning the assumptions about the things that we already know. So this is Frank Belrose. He was at Forbes Biological Station from the 1930s through the 1980s. He is the Belrose of the Belrose Waterfowl Research Center, and he literally wrote the book on wood ducks. But most of his research here in Illinois was focused on the breeding season for this species. And as the name implied, wood ducks live in places with trees. They really like forested wetlands, and they spend a lot of time in those wetlands during the breeding season. Around the time that I started at the station, we got a project going to look at their behavior and their habitat use in the fall, and we assumed that they were going to end up spending a lot of their time in forested wetlands. So just to give you a little idea of the scope, so this is Havana, the field station's right here, and all of these points are places where we tracked a wood duck to over a 3-year period. So we tagged several hundred wood ducks, followed them around with telemetry trucks, and spied on their movements. And so we were able to learn a lot about how they move from day to day. We were able to see really interesting things about how on kind of a typical basis, they're moving from like one place to another, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But at some point, there's some kind of disturbance that happens or something, and they'll pick a new place and start going back and forth, back and forth. And then a couple weeks later, they pick up and they start doing these back and forth movements. And some of these back and forth movements are between farm ponds and ditches. They are not just spending time on Emiquon or on these large state and federal national wildlife refuges. They are spending a lot of time moving away from the river out into what is largely an agriculturally dominated landscape. They are not spending time in flooded timber. They are spending time in ditches and farm ponds, which is not what we were expecting at all. And this kind of played out as well in when we looked at the habitat selection. So things that are above the line are things that are being positively selected for. So these are things that they're using more frequently than they occur in the landscape. Things that are below the line are things they're selecting against. So they're using them less frequently than they occur on the landscape. And so if this was a breeding season study, we would expect to see these bars for bottomland forest to be very tall, very high, very positive, because we know that wood ducks spend a lot of time in the forest in the breeding season. But in the fall, we actually saw that they were choosing against those, and they were instead choosing impounded wetlands, they were choosing ponds, and they were choosing ditches. This is really interesting and also really important as we think about the conservation of the wood duck. So if you go back 60, 70 years, we did not have nearly the number of wood ducks in Illinois that we have today. People were concerned that we were going to lose wood ducks completely from the state. And a ton of work has been done to bring those birds back. It's a really amazing conservation success story. But if we want to continue to have this species, we can't just focus on providing habitat for it during the breeding season. And so we're working on getting this submitted to a journal soon and working with the DNR as well on thinking on how we can continue to support our wood ducks. So let's jump forward to the spring. So now we're in this part of the calendar. We've got a lot of waterfowl that either spend the winter here or they come back really early, like in February and in March, we'll start to see huge numbers of diving ducks show up. And then a little after that, we'll start to see more and more dabblers. We also have a lot of other birds, shore birds, wetland birds that are starting to move through the state during that time of year. And we don't really have a great understanding of how the waterfowl habitat that we're providing is supporting those species. And so we've spent a lot of time looking at the waterfowl themselves, and again, kind of digging into some of those questions. And so this is a project that Chelsea, who just left the station for a job with Fish and Wildlife, has been leading, looking at green-winged teal and gadwall. And originally this was a project that was focused on estimating survival. We don't know a lot about waterfowl in the spring, which is kind of wild given the number of things that we do know about ducks. But we had assumed that the spring season was going to be a time of high mortality. These birds have made it through the winter. They might not be in the best body condition. They're, moving around this landscape that might be largely depleted of food. We expected that they weren't going to survive very much. Turns out they survived quite well, to the point that you can't run survival models on them because so many of them lived. And so we changed this from being a survival study into looking at their habitat use. And we found that they're largely using these emergent and open areas, but they're also using woody areas during the day. And so this is again kind of begging us to question some of our assumptions about where species like gadwall and green-winged teal might be spending a lot of their time. So we're asking these wetlands to do a lot of different things for us, and we also need to be kind of questioning what we've already seen. This is Chad Kramer, sorry, not that. This is Chad. He's my master's student. He's at the U of I. I co-advise him with Mike Ward, who's in the NRES department there. And he's been putting tags on these cute little guys. This is a Sora. And so we've been putting out these tags at the Emaquan Preserve and at Banner Marsh, and they're part of this larger network of automated telemetry towers. And so we put out the tags, and every time one of Chad's birds flies by somebody else's tower, we get that information back. So it's a collaborative network of towers across the Western Hemisphere. And he's been putting out tags on Sora and also on Virginia Rail. And he's been, he's still working through the analysis. He's hopefully going to defend in the spring. But one of the neat things that we've already noticed is, so these green lines are a movement where a bird was tagged here in the spring, and then the detection is still in that same spring. The orange are these are fall detections. So green means they're moving north, orange means they're moving south. And as you'll see, with the exception of this one line, all of these birds are kind of here in kind of the greater Mississippi Valley, okay? Which is really interesting, just biologically, but it's also interesting because there was a graduate student a couple of years ago who did a similar study tagging birds here in Ohio, and all of her birds bounced north over here. None of her birds made it to the Western Great Lakes, which suggests that there might be some kind of migratory flyway system going on with these birds. We think about that a lot for waterfowl, but also for rails. And Chad's work is really helping us look at the timing differences between these species and some of our ducks so that we can then start designing some experiments to dig into that more. All right, let's talk a little bit about summer. So this is the time of the year where things in wetland management get especially tricky, because we've often drawn our wetlands down, which is just a fancy word for let the water out of them so that they dry out, so that a lot of this annual vegetation can grow up. Things like smartweeds and millets really need to have a fairly dry condition to germinate before you put more water back on. And the big problem is for species like least bittern. So least bitterns are really cool. They're very secretive. They spend a lot of time in emergent wetlands. You can't find them a lot of places in Illinois. And it turns out that having water underneath their nests is really important. So this is Stephanie Schmidt. She finished her master's with me last year at the U of I with TJ Benson. And so she was looking at least bitterns and common gallinules, which live in this very tall emergent wetland vegetation like Stephanie is standing in. And they actually build these hammock nests. So they're basically weaving the vegetation together, laying their eggs in that nest, and there might be several feet below that nest to the water. But oftentimes they're building their nest over water, and then throughout the summer, the water either evaporates or is actually pumped out of that wetland as a part of management, and it can completely dry out underneath. And so what Stephanie found is that as the water depth gets deeper, the nests and the young have a better chance of surviving. And she put cameras on these nests to be able to see what kind of predators were coming in. And that seems to be driven by the fact that when you have deep water under a nest, you're excluding your mammalian predators. So raccoons don't like to swim to try and find bird nests. The snakes will find the bird nests regardless of the water conditions. So there is still some mortality occurring. But you know, that's just snakes got to eat too. But when we think about trying to provide high quality habitat for species like common gallinule, least bittern, black crowned night heron, we need to be thinking not just about you know, providing the right habitat structure, but also the right water conditions. And this can get even more complicated as we start to look at very different landscapes. So this is Nora Hargett. She's working on her master's with me. She's also co-advised with TJ Benson. And she's working on black rails out in Colorado. And here, you know, here in Illinois, I mean, especially over by the Illinois River, we have like these big wetlands that are along the river. They're a part of the floodplain. In Colorado, you're largely dealing with these very narrow strips of habitat along these like seasonal creeks. It's like a short grass prairie desert next to them. It's a very different kind of a system. And so when we're talking about water level management, we're often talking about this like pulse of water that comes in the spring from snow melt, because this is a photo of Colorado. I realize there are no mountains, but there are parts of Colorado with no mountains in them. And so we're talking about snow melt coming from the mountains into these systems, and all the water after that has to be negotiated with all of the people that also need water in southeastern Colorado. And so it gets really complicated to figure out how to provide habitat for a federally threatened bird when the people that live there also need the water, and the farmers that live there also need the water, and the cattle that live there also need the water. And so here in Illinois, when we kind of look forward with climate change, we often, you know, we're not going to more than likely get into the same kind of situation that Colorado has in terms of water rights. We're often talking about having too much water on the landscape. It's very much the opposite in Colorado. This is Jess. She's working on her master's with me. She's at the University of Arkansas, working with Caleb Roberts. And she is working down in southeastern Arkansas on king rail, which is the bird she's holding there. And so here, when we're talking about water level management and we're talking about management in the summer, we're talking about trying to have a lot of habitat heterogeneity. So we're talking about water level management, but we're also talking about using it to create a very specific plant community. So this is Jess and her tech Jen out on one of their field sites this summer. And as you can hopefully see here, there's a lot of different colors of green going on. There's a lot of different species of plants, a lot of diversity. If you look at the sites where Stephanie worked, they're largely dominated by different species of cattail. And if you just look out over it to the initial look, it all looks exactly the same. When you look at Jess's sites, you see a very diverse plant community, which is in part because of the water level management that happens here. This is the only site in the state of Arkansas that has multiple breeding pairs of king rails. And so Jess's project is trying to figure out like what makes the king rails so happy here so that we can turn around and try and expand the places that they're able to thrive in Arkansas, which is going to involve some really strong trade-offs with waterfowl management, which is a big driver in that state as well. So when we talk about seasonal trade-offs, you know, when we talk about trade-offs, we often think of it as being kind of a negative thing. You know, it's like, oh, well, someone has to lose if there's a trade-off. But I often try to think of it instead of finding ways to think about it as opportunities and thinking about ways where we can kind of find success together. And so this is one of the sites I worked on for my PhD. This is Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Missouri. And these like linear shapes you can see here are the levees that separate these different units. And when we think about emergent wetland management, especially in the Midwest, we're often not talking about a singular wetland. We're talking about a complex of wetlands. So lots of little wetland cells. And when we look at this, we can see a lot of opportunity. Because even if we need to provide habitat for waterfowl, we can do that in some of these cells while also using other ones to provide habitat for other organisms. And oftentimes, even in cells where we're providing habitat for waterfowl, we need to change up the management every so often to fight back invasive species or woody encroachment anyway. And so thinking about ways that we can use these other organisms to create good habitat for them while fighting maybe the things that we don't want for ducks can help us provide good opportunity if we think about providing habitat for these species at the larger landscape. Because if we just put all of this onto one wetland, I would argue we're asking it to wear way too many hats. No one wetland can do all of these things. We instead need to start thinking about the broader landscape. And there's some really good examples here in Illinois and across the region where even across ownership boundaries, organizations are starting to work together to think about their management more as a complex of wetlands and less about, like a singular wetland, which is really cool. So that's kind of one part of thinking about wetland management and how we're asking a lot of our wetlands. I'm going to kind of take the second part of my talk and talk a little bit about a project that I lead in the Gulf, where instead of looking at kind of trade-offs among seasons, we're looking at trade-offs, between people and birds and between kind of the way that we put fire on the landscape. And so this is one of our sites in Louisiana. That's an oil refinery in the background there. And so this is the landscape that we're often working in the Gulf when we think about coastal wetlands, where it's a very human-dominated landscape. It's a very human-influenced landscape, and understandably so. The people that live here are very, very persistent people. They are willing to put up with a lot when it comes to hurricanes and other kinds of extreme weather. And so, kind of making sure that there's space for them on the landscape along with these birds is really important. So this is a really big project that I have the pleasure of leading. And so I just want to acknowledge that it's a really, really big team. We're doing field work across 5 states, and there's also a big mapping component as well. So just want to acknowledge that it's certainly not just me doing all of this work. Is literally would not be possible. So on the Firebird project, a big thing that we're focused on is the application of prescribed fire. So if you think back like several hundred years ago, there was a lot of fire happening in the southeastern US. So some of it was being intentionally set by different indigenous nations in the Southeast as a part of their habitat management practices of the land. And a lot of it was happening from lightning as well. And most of the intentional fire setting was happening in the upland areas and the forested systems. But we know that fire was coming out into these wetlands, into these high marsh areas, probably typically just through these like fingers of fire that would come out into the wetland. And so fire has been a part of these systems for a really long time, but we really need to, there's kind of been this uncertainty identified about how can we use it to benefit our focal species. And so, okay, wait, back, okay. I thought I had this bigger, but anyway, so our focal species are the mottled duck, which is the one species of duck we have in the eastern United States that's non-migratory. It's a really cool bird. It just lives in the Gulf of Mexico. It looks a lot like a mallard to the untrained eye, and is not doing super well. They're a population in decline. This is a yellow rail, which is another species of conservation concern. They're only in the Gulf of Mexico in the winter. And then this is the eastern black rail, which is a federally threatened bird. And black rails have the kind of this weird strategy where some of them are fully resident in the Gulf of Mexico. So they spend their whole year there, they nest there, they do all their things, and some of them migrate. So they have kind of a split strategy. We're not really sure why. And so back in 2018, when I was a postdoc in Mississippi, the black rail was being proposed for listing by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and there was a lot of concern that the listing of black rail was going to limit our ability to put prescribed fire on the landscape. We already had a pretty good idea of how to use fire to benefit mottled duck. That research had been going on for a while, but we didn't really know what was good for the black rail, and we wanted to make sure that we could continue to do things that were good for mottled ducks. And so that's kind of where this project came out of. And part of that has been trying to figure out what kind of circulation patterns are good for the fire. So we were hearing from the folks who are actually doing the fire on the ground in the Gulf that it's becoming more challenging to burn. So to do a safe prescribed fire, you have to have very certain climatic conditions. You have to have certain conditions in the place you're going to burn. You also have to have a certain number of people on site to be able, like, there's a lot of things that have to fall into place. And it can be really challenging if you have everything in place and then the weather goes sideways. And so what we were hearing, from the prescribed fire community was that it was becoming more difficult to burn because of the weather. That doesn't exactly play out in what we found in the data. So we worked with Bob Rowley, who's at Louisiana State University. He's a climatologist, and he was able to work through climatic data over the past 30 years to kind of lump the weather conditions in the Gulf into kind of 8 general patterns. And he can explain this part to you better than I can, but a lot of it has to do with whether you have onshore or offshore winds in a given area, which when you're talking about fire is a really big deal, because when you're talking about fire, you're talking about smoke, and we typically don't want to send smoke into places with people. And so what we found was not so much that there had been a change in the amount of good weather days that were available, but what we more found was that there was a strong selection in the Western and Eastern Gulf for different kinds of circulation patterns. And that when the prescribed fire managers from across the Gulf are getting together and talking to each other, the conditions that a prescribed fire manager in Florida is describing as being really good are actually the opposite for somebody in Texas. So the Gulf is shaped like this. So if it's offshore winds for somebody, it's onshore winds for the other people. And so a lot of what we're finding is actually that there's a lot of Western versus Eastern Gulf variation in what makes good weather. And that there's also, because of the increasing human population in the Gulf, we're seeing it being a lot more challenging to put fire on the landscape because of the risk of smoking out a hospital or a nursing home or an elementary school, which is not an outcome that we want to have. So this project is hopefully going to be going up for renewal next year, and we're going to be working with some social scientists on building some things in to help us better understand how the local communities perceive prescribed fire and what risks they're most concerned about, so that we can work on designing some projects to help address those concerns. This project has also been really focused on trying to better understand where the high marsh is. So high marsh is the upland part of a coastal wetland. It doesn't receive inundation on a daily basis. And so it's a very saline environment, but often when you look at like a land cover map where you're like, this is forest and this is urban and whatever, you'll just see coastal wetland. It doesn't really split it between high and low marsh. And so that is where Nicholas and Christine have been working. So this is a little bit more in-depth picture of what high marsh can look like. This is a site in Louisiana. So there's a little bit of baccaris through here. So baccaris is this woody vegetation you're seeing. And then there is a bunch of spartina. So that's the grass that you're seeing as well. And so this is what really good black rail habitat looks like. And this is just kind of an example of kind of where that is. So like this would be the water here. This is the part of the wetland that's inundated on a daily basis with tidal activity. And then a couple of times a month on the very highest tides or in times of storm surge, you'll get into the high marsh. And so Nicholas and Christine have been working on doing some remote sensing work to actually develop a map that they recently published that looks at the 5 state-wide area of where high marsh actually is. So they built an initial product based on elevation, and then we did a bunch of data collection in 2021, and they were able to incorporate that in to actually make a predictive map. So the different colors here are the relative predictions of whether or not a given site is high marsh. And so the data set is available and they're working through some papers now. We're really excited about this because it allows us to highlight new areas that we aren't currently looking for these species to go in and explore. And we're also excited for the opportunities it provides for organizations like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is responsible for the recovery of the black rail, to be able to identify key areas for conservation. And so kind of the rest of the project is focused on like trying to better understand the relationship between fire and the birds. And so we've been working through an adaptive management process. So the way that this works is we've brought together the prescribed fire practitioners, the wetland managers, the species experts, and through a series of workshops, we've developed kind of very specific objectives and performance measures. So what is it that those organizations and the people that work for them value about these species and about this habitat? And at the end, we kind of focused in on kind of the key one being maximizing the occupancy for our focal species, which are black rail, yellow rail, and mottled duck. We then worked through creating these conceptual models of how the system works. So if you burn a wetland, how do you think it impacts the bird, and what are kind of the steps that get you there? And through those conceptual models, we then generated 9 different hypotheses of how management actions might affect their outcomes. And our goal was to then pick 1 or 2 of those hypotheses to actually design the experimental part of the project around. Kind of the tricky thing is that all 9 hypotheses sounded pretty plausible, right? They've been generated by this big group of experts. And so we went through something called a qualitative value of information exercise. And so we went back to our experts and we said, look at these 9 different hypotheses. How reducible do you think these are? So these are all hypotheses because there's some uncertainty, right? If we knew it for sure, it wouldn't be a hypothesis anymore, right? And so basically we're saying, do you think it's possible to design a study to reduce the amount of uncertainty around our prediction for a given hypothesis? So a high number means yes, we think it's reducible. A low number means it might be really hard to design a study to actually answer that. So that's what's going on the y-axis. On the x-axis is the QVOI, or the qualitative value of information. And so this is a ranked thing where basically we're saying, how valuable is it to you in the course of your job as a manager or a biologist to have this question answered? Because it's not all 9 are going to be equally valuable to everybody. And so what this allowed us to do then is look at which hypotheses are up here in this upper right-hand quadrant, which are the things that are the most valuable and the most reducible. So the things we have the best chance of actually designing a study around. And so we ended up picking number 8, which has to do with fire return interval. So basically this is, if we burn a wetland, how long should we leave it alone before we burn it again? And how quickly do the birds come back? How long do they thrive at a site before we should again apply prescribed fire? And through working with our experts, we kind of made the prediction that we think it's going to be somewhere between 2 and 5 years. And we suspect that there's going to be a different answer for the Eastern and Western Gulf. So there's some really strong differences in precipitation between the Eastern and Western Gulf. And in places that receive a lot more rain, we're expecting the vegetation is going to grow back a lot faster. And thus it's going to need to be burned more quickly. Because what we don't want is for the vegetation to grow so thick and so dense that these birds can't move through it. Especially because black rail, they're not big, they're like this big, and they do not like to fly. And so they want to be in underneath that vegetation. And so that is what we have been doing for the past 3 years, is going out and collecting all of that data. I really wish I had the results to share with you, but we don't have them done yet. So very soon we hope to have a little better idea of what the exact answer is going to be. Anecdotally, it looks like it's probably going to end up being more in the 2 to 3 year range in the Western Gulf, and maybe the 3 to 4 year range in the Eastern Gulf, but that's without having the analysis done. This is my student, Lauren. She is also at U of I, at TJ, and she's been digging into kind of some more of the mechanisms behind how these birds are responding to the fire. So she's trying to better understand how the predator communities and the invertebrate communities differ between sites with different fire histories. So she spent this past summer down in Louisiana, which, if you paid attention to the weather, is kind of a miracle because it was like 100 degrees every single day for like 2.5 months. It was ridiculous, but she did not melt, and she's got all kinds of great invertebrate samples that she's going through right now. And so her project is going to be helping us kind of look at these mechanistic pieces. The larger project is just measuring, this is when the fire took place, here's how the birds respond, and her dissertation is going to kind of help us fill that hole in the middle. So overall, you know, we're kind of trying to turn this research wheel and generate more information about how we can apply prescribed fire for the species. You know, mottled ducks are declining, and we don't really have a great idea why. They're an actively hunted species in the Gulf, and a species that has a lot of public support. You know, black rail is federally listed and, you know, could easily go extinct in my lifetime. So there's a lot of urgency around the work that we're doing, and we're pretty excited about that. And the opportunity to get to do some cool science and also help the species. We're, you know, kind of very much looking to the future as well, and realizing that fire isn't kind of the only threat to these birds. We're hoping to continue our prescribed fire experiments, but also start looking at sea level rise resilience and how we might be able to try and move some of these habitats upslope. I think I mentioned earlier, we're going to try and bring a social scientist onto the team as well to help us understand how to build more public tolerance for fire. And we're also hoping to work with some engineers on how do you actually build a high marsh. We have a pretty good idea of how to build islands in the Gulf for like beach nesting birds and things, but we don't really have a great idea about how to build this particular kind of wetland. So lots more, like any good project, it's just generated more questions. So we've covered a lot of ground in the past 45 minutes, but you know, wetlands are, to me, just the coolest places on earth. That's not the way that everybody feels, and it's certainly not the way that we've always felt. But I think that wetlands also provide us this really cool opportunity to look at many different ways that they can serve us as people, but also serve the animals that we enjoy and that we care about. We ask them to do a lot for us, but they give us a lot in return. And I think that that's pretty fun. So yeah, if you have any questions, I'm glad to take them. Thank you so much for your attention.
So on the bird monitoring, when you put tags on them, how long do those tags last? Is it like a year-long tag before it falls off?
Yeah, it depends on the tag. So the solar powered tags that we put on a lot of our waterfowl could theoretically work for many years. Typically something happens along the way and we don't, water gets into it, or we've even had one tag where someone probably shot at the bird, only succeeded in shooting the tag, and we recaught the bird later, and there was actually a piece of steel shot in the transmitter. The bird was perfectly fine, so that tag didn't work anymore. So typically we expect to get somewhere between 6 to 12 months of data out of a tag, though theoretically they could last a lot longer, but it really just depends. We're putting tiny computers out in the wetlands, so things can go wrong. Yeah.
How did you arrive at like the 1 to 3 year fire period? Thinking like that's gonna be that's maybe how it naturally was, it like that's how we believe it naturally burned, or it's kind of for the specific management?
Yeah, so some of that comes from places where we're actively putting fire on the ground right now for mottled duck, and we're also finding the other species there, so we know that it's at least somewhat meeting their needs. Some of it comes from historic information as well. So they've done these really, really deep soil cores where they look for the charcoal layers and they're trying to understand the historic frequency. For biogeochemistry reasons that I honestly don't fully understand, it's really difficult to do that in wetlands. And so our understanding is pretty limited. But in Florida, in the coastal wetlands, they think that the historic fire return interval was probably more in the 6 to 10 year realm. And so it's a little hard to say why, our results might suggest something shorter, but those systems have been removed from their natural fire regime for a long time.
I guess that, from working in Missouri, I remember meeting with managers who seemed a little conflicted about managing for smartweed versus birds or things during different seasons. So we did leave the marshes pretty dry. And I don't recall having a lot of multi-cell wetlands that we dealt with. There'd be managers that manage cells for different wetlands across a landscape. Can you talk a little bit about any pushback for that management, or do you have folks that are really on board with managing in different ways in different places?
It depends a lot on the manager and a lot on the agency as well. Different states and federal agencies kind of have different amounts of top-down control over their land management. So Missouri tends to be a state where they kind of coordinate theirs more. Whereas in the National Wildlife Refuge System with Fish and Wildlife, if you're the refuge manager, you're often this is my land and I get to do what I want. And so it really comes down to individuals. We do workshops about wetland management across the state every year, in part because I think you kind of have to go out and see it being successful somewhere else before you're willing to change what you're doing. So we try to find places that are good examples of kind of multi-species management, and then try to bring people to them to be see, this place shoots a lot of ducks and it has least bitterns. Isn't that cool? And so that can slowly change people's minds. But yeah, there's still plenty of folks who would rather just plant corn, flood it to ear level, and call it a day. So, which is great for mallards and not really for everything else. So.
I feel like I have so many questions I can ask you later.
So have there been any attempts to restore the wetlands that have been drained, or is it once it's drained, it's gone forever?
No, there are some really great examples of successful restorations. So there's two, especially along the Illinois River. So one is the Dixon Refuge, which is north of Peoria. And then the other is the Emequan Preserve, which is right by Havana. So those were both in row crop agriculture. Emequan was in row crop agriculture for, I believe, almost 70 years. And they just stopped pumping the water out. They didn't have to, they've planted some of the trees that are there, but all of the emergent vegetation that came from the seed bank that was in the soil. So if it was a wetland before, there's a pretty good chance. I mean, it depends a little bit on what the management was done, but oftentimes restoration is possible. It's not simple, but it definitely can be done. Yeah, which is very exciting. If you guys haven't been to Emequan, I highly encourage a visit. It's very cool.
So on the restoration, if you have trying to like restore a wetland and they don't have enough of the seeds and things, are you able to like transplant
Mhm.
from one culture to other and be successful?
Yeah, that can definitely work. There's a couple of sites that I worked at in Tennessee very briefly, where they had actually, for various agricultural reasons, like removed the topsoil at one point. And so when they started to flood it back up, there really wasn't a lot of seed bank because they had removed it for other reasons. And so you can come in, you can get seeds, or you can actually get plants and plant them out there. And within a couple of years, they'll propagate pretty well. So yeah, that's a lot more labor intensive and a lot more expensive, but it definitely can work.
I might add to that. So I've been to Emequan a lot and it is super awesome, but they flooded it. I mean, and there were seeds there, but I also helped them plant stuff along the perimeter. So yeah, people do both, right? Just let it go and add things. So, and this awesome example very close to us.
Yeah.
Is that for questions?
Thanks, everybody.
If any faculty want to join us for lunch, you're more than welcome.